You're telling me humans have just been watching this entire time? The room fell silent as General Corvo of the Zin Consortium stared at the holographic display. Every other race in the intergalactic coalition had already thrown everything they had into the war effort, exhausting their resources in the long and bloody struggle against the Qadari. Yet somewhere in the background, humans had lingered. They had sent aid, sure, and provided logistics support, but direct military action, not a single human ship had entered the fray until now. Yes, General replied Admiral Merrick of the Archak Union, his scaled face betraying no emotion. Humanity officially declared its intent to engage in combat operations. As of 10 minutes ago, Corvo rubbed his temples in disbelief. He had heard rumors of human capabilities, but dismissed them as exaggerated death-worlder bravado, now facing the cold reality of the situation. He felt a strange mixture of anxiety and curiosity. Why now, and more importantly, what were the humans planning to do in a conflict that had dragged on for years? Show me their initial movements. Corvo ordered, his voice a touch sharper than intended. The holographic map of the galaxy zoomed in on the contested sectors. The Qadari fleet had established formidable defensive lines in KR star systems, daring anyone to challenge them. Humanity's forces had materialized at the edge of the battlefield, a mere blip against the vast armadas of their enemies as the human signature warships emerged on the display. Whispers circulated among the assembled coalition commanders. Human ships were sleek and compact, lacking the imposing size and gutty weapon arrays of other species. They seemed at first glance grossly underprepared. That's it, someone muttered skeptically. Corvo narrowed his eyes at the display, watching as the human vessels formed a tight formation. There was no grand show of force, no drawn-out posturing. In fact, to the untrained eye, it appeared almost absurdly minimal. A lone command ship, a scattering of destroyers, and a squadron of escort frigs, the humans had committed what looked like a fraction of their fleet. The room filled with an unsettling quiet as everyone processed what they were seeing. The Qadari responded almost immediately, shifting their forces to meet the new threat. The enemy had no reason to take the human force seriously. After all, no one else had managed to break their lines in years. Then it began. Corvo blinked, hardly believing his eyes. The human ships moved with precision that bordered on artistry, cutting through space with alarming speed within seconds. The coalition's network of communication channels buzzed with reports of electromagnetic pulses and sensor jamming for the Qadari. It was like being blindfolded in the middle of a storm. What are they doing? Admiral Merrick's usually composed demeanor cracked his voice, betraying a hint of awe. Electronic warfare, Corvo replied, his tone uncertain. But this is on a scale I've never seen before. The Qadari fleets floundered as their targeting systems and defensive measures became little more than dead weight. Human ships darted in and out of form with a grace that seemed almost casual, launching volleys of high-velocity projectiles. It wasn't the brute force assaults the coalition had grown used to seeing. This was something else. Warfare reduced to a deadly ballet. Sir, the Kidder's outer defenses are collapsing. A comms officer reported, eyes wide as he stared at the data streams flooding in. Corvo leaned forward in his seat, focusing intently on the display. This was the moment with the humans. Press their advantage or fall back. His doubts were immediately answered when the human fleet accelerated, exploiting the chaos they had created. Their tactics shifted fluidly, seemingly predicting the Qadari every attempt at countermeasures. Howard Morak began trailing off as he watched another sector fall to the human advance. It's as if they knew exactly where to strike. Corvo couldn't help but marvel at the spectacle. The humans moved with an efficiency that was almost inhuman, and their strategy defied conventional military logic. Most species threw waves of ships at their enemies, relying on overwhelming force to break through defenses. Humans, on the other hand, used precision strikes, disabling critical systems and leaving the Keter fleet to flounder like a beast stripped of its senses. What kind of weaponry are they using? One of the coalition officers blurted out, his tone a mix of horror and fascination. Their weapons seem convention, a tactical analyst stammered, but they're using them in ways we never considered as the minutes ticked by. The Coalition command room descended into a stunned silence. A full hour had passed since humanity's first engagement, and the Qadari mighty armadas were reduced to a fragmented, retreating mess. Even the Coalition's most optimistic projections hadn't accounted for this level of effectiveness. Corvo Watch is the holographic map updated showing Qadari strongholds going, dark one after another. This wasn't just a victory. It was a dissection. The humans weren't merely overpowering the enemy. They were tearing apart the Qadar's entire battle, doctrine sector. Gamma has fallen. The comms officer announced, breaking the silence, and reports indicate no human losses impossible Morak. His scaled features twitching in disbelief. How can they sustain 0 casualties? Corvo swallowed hard. His eyes locked onto the tactical feed. The human fleet continued its relentless advance. Their ships weaving through debris fields and evading incoming fire with an ease that seemed almost playful. As another Qadari command ship was reduced to a ball of flame, it became evident that this was no fluke. The humans were not just skilled. They were on a completely different level. "I don't understand," Corvo admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "What have they been doing all this time? If not fighting, preparing a new voice." Sea and cold and analytical, all heads turned to see a human officer standing at the doorway, clad in a crisp uniform devoid of ornamentation. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, scanned the room as if assessing each individual's worth. "You call this a war?" He continued, striding forward to the center of the room. "But to us it's an exercise, a test of tactical adaptability." The Coalition officers exchanged uncertain glances. The human's tone was neither boastful nor arrogant. It was matter-of-fact. Corvo clenched his jaw, unsure whether to feel anger or grudging admiration. "What's your objective?" Corvo demanded, struggling to keep his voice steady. Why now? The human officer tilted his head slightly, as if considering how to best explain something painfully obvious. "Our objective," he began, "is to end this conflict in the most efficient manner possible, and as for why now we waited until you were ready to accept our methods..." Corvo felt a shiver run down his spine. The words were simple, almost benign, yet they carried a weight that suggested something far beyond what any of them had anticipated. Ready. "You think we were ready for this?" Mar scoffed, shaking his head. The human's gaze turned to the holographic map, where the last remnants of the Qadari forces were being systematically dismantled if you weren't. He replied calmly, "This war would have ended much sooner." Corvo stared at the map, struggling to process the unfolding events. The humans were pushing toward the heart of Qadari territory. Their advance so rapid it defied explanation. And yet as he watched, a thought began to form, a question that he wasn't sure he wanted the answer to. Just what kind of war had humanity been preparing for all this time? Corvo's eyes stayed fixed on the holographic display play as the humans pressed deeper into Qadari territory. The Coalition commanders around him remained silent, transfixed by the near absurdity unfolding before them. The human fleet wasn't just fighting, it was dissecting its opponents, exploiting every weakness, with a precision that bordered on supernatural. "Report," barked Admiral Merrick, breaking the silence. "What's the status of the CER Central Command?" The tactical officer's eyes darted between screens, hands trembling as he processed the incoming data. "Central Command, it's failing, sir. The humans have neutralized their shield arrays, and they're launching boarding pods as we speak." Corvo felt his jaw clench involuntarily. The Qadari Central Command was a fortress protected by layers of defenses that had held against every Coalition assault for years. Now those defenses were failing one by one like brittle glass under a relentless hammer boarding pods. Merrick echoed his tone, a mixture of disbelief and horror. Their going inside, the human officer standing nearby merely nodded, his expression impassive. "Yes," he said simply, "we find that surgical strikes are more effective than brute force. Our objective is to seize control, not annihilate it. Corvo glanced at the officer, unable to suppress a sense of dread. These humans, with their calm demeanor and deliberate actions, were nothing like the rabbit warriors he had expected. They were methodical, calculating and frighteningly detached from the chaos they were orchestrating. How are they managing this? Another coalition commander asked, his voice shaky. We've been fighting the Qadari for years and barely dented their defenses. And now this training, the human officer replied. Matter-of-factly, we've trained for scenarios like this long before we even encountered the Qadari space warfare ground combat electronic countermeasures. It's all part of the doctrine. Doctrine, Corvo repeated, narrowing his eyes. You make it sound like you expected this war. The human officer turned to face Corvo, his expression betraying nothing. Expected number prepared for, always. The response sent a chill through the room. The coalition had gone to war out of necessity, driven by a desperate need to defend their territories from the Qadari onslaught. But the humans, they had been preparing for war as if it were an inevitability. And now, as Corvo watched the human fleet systematically dismantle the Qadari defenses, he realized that this was not just a show of military might. It was a demonstration of control. General Corvo. A voice crackled through the command room speakers, interrupting his thoughts. It was one of the coalition's reconnaissance officers stationed near the Kiter border. The Kiter flagship is moving. It's trying to retreat to a more fortified sector. Let me guess. Marek said, his tone laced with bitter sarcasm. The humans have already anticipated that the human officer didn't so much as blink. Of course they'll allow the flagship to retreat for now. It's an old tactic, push them to their last bastion where they feel safe. Then remove even that sense of security. Corvo couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're toying with them, he asked, incredulous. Not toying. The human officer corrected his voice, devoid of emotion. We're ensuring that when they fall completely, no room for recovery, no chance to regroup. This war has dragged on because everyone fought piecemeal. We don't. Corvo turned back to the map, watching as the Qadari fleet scrambled to reposition. Panic had clearly set in. The humans had broken the unspoken rules of this conflict, operating on a level that the Qadar had never encountered before, as more sectors fell under human control. It became evident that the Qadari weren't just losing a battle, they were being undone. We're getting reports of ground operations, the tactical officer announced, eyes wide with shock. The humans have deployed their soldiers to key Qadari planets. Morak let out a low hiss. How are they already launching ground assaults? We've barely established space superiority. The human officer crossed his arms, eyes glued to the map. Parallel operations. While space forces disrupt and dismantle enemy fleets, ground units secure key installations. We trained for this to overwhelm on multiple fronts. Simultaneously, Corvo felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Every coalition force had focused on one front at a time, struggling to balance the demands of space and ground combat. But the humans, they seemed to have mastered, both executing their plan with a level of coordination that bore ordered on inhuman ground reports. Coming in, the comms officer said, his voice barely above a whisper. The humans have neutralized the Qadari planetary defenses. No significant resistance. Corvo nearly choked on his disbelief. The Qadari planets were fortresses, shielded and armed to the teeth. Coalition forces had tried for months, if not years, to breach them, with little to show for their efforts. Yet here were the humans taking those planets in mere moments. What kind of soldiers are they? Someone muttered, voicing the question that lingered in every mind. Our soldiers are adaptable. The human officer replied, his tone suggesting that the answer was self-evident. We trained them not just to fight, but to think, to analyze, adapt, and exploit weaknesses in real time. A hush settled over the room as the coalition officers absorbed this. The humans had turned war into a science one, where victory was less about raw power and more about precision. It was terrifying. What's their next move? Corvo found himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The flagship, the human officer replied without hesitation. They'll let it retreat, and then they'll cut off every route back to safety once isolated. The Qadari command will have no choice but to surrender or be wiped out. So that's it. Merrick questioned, eyes wide. They're already in, anticipating the endgame, anticipating the human officer. Smirked a flicker of something almost resembling amusement crossing his face for the first time. No, they're enacting it. This war was over the moment we entered the coalition. Commanders exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just the humans' tactics or technology that unsettled them. It was their attitude. They approached war as if it were an equation to be solved. Each variable accounted for, each outcome calculated. The room fell silent again as the humans continued. Their advance, more Kari worlds, went dark on the map one after another, like stars winking out in a vast night sky. The holographic display now showed the Qadari flagship retreating toward its last stronghold, pursued not by a swarm of human ships, but by a calculated, relentless force. What happens if the Qadari surrender? Corvo asked, almost dreading the answer. The human officer's eyes narrowed. Then they live, he said simply. We don't fight to terminate. We fight to win, and to make sure no one ever thinks of challenging us again. Corvo nodded, swallowing hard. There was a cold logic to it, a ruthlessness that defied everything he had ever known about warfare. The humans had entered the battlefield, not just to win, but to redefine what winning meant. As the map continued to shift, the Qadar's last bastion on the brink of collapse, Corvo couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much larger, and he had no idea what that something was. The room was cloaked in a tense silence as the holographic display revealed the final stages of the human offensive. The Qadari flagship, once a symbol of indomitable power, now appeared small and insignificant as it limped toward its last fortified sector. Its hull was scarred from earlier engagements, thrusters flickering erratically, and its once mighty escorts were little more than debris scattered across space. Kor glanced around the command center where coalition officers sat in stunned disbelief. Some were expressions of awe, others fear, but none could hide their fascination with the humans' unfolding strategy. A mere 5 hours ago, the Qadari had been considered unbeatable. Now their defeat seemed not only possible, but inevitable. Human fleet is closing in on the flagships. Fallback point, reported the tactical officer. His voice was shaky, as if he himself couldn't quite grasp what was happening. They've surrounded the sector, blocking every escape route. Any signs of Qadari reinforcements? Corvo asked, though he suspected the answer. None, sir. The humans, they've already crippled their supply lines and reserve forces, the officer replied, shaking his head in disbelief. It's over. They have nowhere left to run. Corvo watched as the human ships formed a precise encirclement around the flagship's final refuge. They made no grand gestures, issued no ultimatums. They merely waited their formation, a silent declaration of dominance. It was a statement as clear as if it had been spoken aloud. There is no escape. The human officer, still standing calmly among the coalition commanders, tilted his head slightly. We've transmitted terms of surrender. He announced the Qadari have 5 minutes to comply. Otherwise, we proceed with final neutralization. Mar let out a low growl, his eyes fixed on the display. And if they don't surrender, he challenged, unable to mask his disdain. You just wipe them out. The human officer's gaze remained impassive. If they choose to reject the terms, then yes, he replied evenly. But understand, our goal is not destruction, it's resolution. The end of a conflict so decisively that it cannot resume. KVO felt a knot in his stomach. The humans operated on an entirely different wavelength, where war was not about glory or honor, but about efficiency and finality. They didn't leave room for ambiguity in their hands. War was a tool to enforce peace, to sculpt the galaxy into a shape where resistance was simply impractical. The Qadari flagship is responding. The comms officer cut in tension, lacing his voice. They're requesting terms. A murmur ran through the coalition command room. Could it be, after years of war, was it really coming to an end? Put it on, Corvo ordered, trying to maintain an air of authority. Despite the surreal situation, the holographic display shifted to show the bridge of the Qadari flagship. The Qadari commander appeared on screen, eyes burning with a mixture of rage and fear. His uniform was disheveled, his once imposing demeanor reduced to a semblance of controlled panic. "We acknowledge your terms, human." The commander spat, his voice trembling. "But know this, you have only won through trickery and deceit, not strength." The human officer stepped forward, his expression unchanged. "You lost because you relied on old doctrines outdated by eons," he said calmly. "Strength lies not in brute force, but in adaptability, in understanding every facet of conflict. We offered you a chance to end this peacefully long before today you chose otherwise." The Kaider commander glared, his defiance hanging by a thread. For a moment it seemed he might lash out, reject the terms out of sheer spite, but then he glanced around his own bridge at the faces of his officers, and the weight of reality settled in. The humans had cornered them, stripped them of every advantage, and now held the galaxy's attention on this final moment. "Very well," the commander muttered. Bowing his head, "We surrender." A wave of shock rippled through the coalition command room. It was over, just like that. Years of grueling conflict, countless lives lost and endless resources expended, had culminated in a surrender within 5 hours of humanity entering the fray. The sheer finality of it left Corvo momentarily speechless. "Transmission confirmed," the CO's officer announced, barely containing his own surprise. "The Qadari have ordered all remaining forces to stand down." The human officer nodded, turning to the coalition commanders. "The war is now officially concluded," he stated simply. "Our ships will begin the stabilization process for Qadari systems, and coalition forces are free to withdraw to their respective territories." Corvo opened his mouth to speak, but words failed him. It felt surreal. The Qadari were defeated not in a drawn-out campaign, but in a surgical strike that lasted mere hours. Humanity had achieved in one engagement what the rest of the galaxy had failed to accomplish over years, but more than that, they had reshaped the entire concept of war. How Corvo finally managed his voice, barely a whisper. "How did you prepare for something like this, to end a war so swiftly?" The human officer regarded him with an inscrutable gaze. "We come from a world where conflict is an inherent part of existence." He explained. "Survival demanded we learn to adapt, to innovate, and to end threats with finality. War is not our goal. It's a means to an end, a peace that others will think twice about disturbing." Corvo nodded, absorbing the words. It wasn't just about power. It was about understanding, about preparing for every eventuality. Humanity had honed their methods, trained their minds, and embraced a brutal efficiency that set them apart. They hadn't merely joined the war, they had transcended it, revealing that victory was not a matter of who fought the longest, but who fought the smartest. As the coalition officers dispersed, Corvo watched the human fleet regroup on the holographic map. They moved with the same quiet precision as they had during the battle, now shifting to their post-war objectives: stabilization, reconstruction. They were not conquerors basking in glory. They were pragmatists, already setting the groundwork for what came next. For the first time in years, Corvo felt a strange sense of hope mingled with an edge of fear. Humanity had shown what they were capable of, and the galaxy would never be the same. They had rewritten the rules of war, and in doing so had forged a path toward a peace that could last. The war had ended not with a grand finale, but with a realization that humanity, in its calculated brilliance, had always known exactly when and how to win.